presenting in a cinematic way is not appropriate for every presentation situation. But for large events, conferences, medical conferences, a TED, a TEDx event, or many kinds of presentation situations you would have where there's a large audience, then having a more cinematic approach can make sense. So first, I want to begin with a kind of origin story. When did I first become interested in this? So this is where I grew up. This is where I've spent my entire life here in the Pacific, in Hawaii, in Oregon, and in Japan. So of course, now I'm here in Nara, Japan, which is about a 11 to 12-hour flight over to where I'm originally from in Oregon, the Beaver State. And it was at that time in Oregon. So wait, let's take a little animated GIF airplane over to my high school. So we're flying over Oregon here, as you can see, kind of like Finland. It's mostly forests. So we'll land here in the football field at my high school. And it's a really beautiful place. It's a great place to grow up and go to school. This is a picture of me with my friends, 17 or 18 years old. And it was at this time in high school that I became interested in public speaking. I had a lot more confidence then than I do now. It's not uncommon, I think, for high school students. So I did a lot of emceeing events and playing music, of course, and all of that. But it was in this biology class that I had, and our senior project was to do a kind of presentation. So, on our work. So I did a 35 millimeter slide presentation, part of this kind of student presentation night, kind of like a science fair. So I had this envision that I'd be here in this auditorium giving a presentation with the slides, and I could just go back and forth and change the slides. It kind of looks something like this, except I had two carousels, so I went kind of back and forth, and it was really nice. And I had this idea that I could become one with the slide. That I didn't call it cinematic. We didn't really talk in those terms then, but I thought it'd be pretty cool. 35 millimeter slides, a big screen, and that I could kind of become one with it. So this is the time before computers, before social media. So the things I looked up to in terms of media was, network news, the local network news, and the weather person, which we called a weatherman in those days, but the meteorologist, whoever, could be a man or a woman. And I thought, oh, this is really cool. I'll make my presentation kind of like that, and then people will really love it. But it didn't really work exactly that way because you see, there's a problem when you're working with a projector, which I found out in these days, is that if you get in front of the projector and the screen, obviously you're going to kind of disappear.
2,000 years later.
But eventually, for example, after I left college, after I graduated college and I was working for Apple and other different companies, sometimes I'd have a backlit projector like this. So you have the screen, but the projector is actually in the back. So you need a space for that. But that allowed the presenter to walk around in front of the screen and interact with the screen, such as here in an Apple store with an old 4x3 screen. Or what became popular is having projectors on the ceiling, and they were very massive, very bright projectors. And so since the projector or the screen didn't start until maybe 2 meters or so up, you could kind of get in front of that screen and not block the picture. So even here in Milan, it's an old 4x3 screen, but it's a little bit high, a little bit higher than me, so I'm not getting in the way. So I can kind of interact with the screen and the presenter, kind of like an old Kamishibai style screen, the storyteller, and then the connection with the audience. But screen technology has really changed. If you might have noticed over the last few years, if you visit any kind of city, you'll just see massive video boards everywhere. Here in Osaka, for example, at many of our train stations, we have these massive video boards. This one is just in the lobby near the elevator in a building here in Osaka. This is a super large screen in Australia. I think this is Los Angeles. Anyway, you see them everywhere. Taylor Swift concert, massive screens, which we couldn't do, 10, 15 years ago. Even in the last few years, the technology has really evolved. This one, for example, is a little bit wider than, well, it's about 1 to 1.85, something like that. It's still very cinematic board, a video board. And what's interesting about this, how they do it, is it's modular. So There are many companies doing this with micro LED and OLED, and there's many kinds of technologies. But it looks something like this, where you just can put it together any shape that you want. Of course, it's very expensive right now. So for the most part, this is in large businesses and hotels. But more and more, you're seeing this at conferences like this and like this. So let's imagine we have a screen like this. So this would not be unusual in today's world to have a screen like this. It's very cinematic. I think obviously it's a little bit wider than the standard 16 by 9. But the problem is you get a screen like this, and a lot of people, a lot of conferences still, even though they have a beautiful screen like this, kind of do things the old fashioned way. 16 by 9 slide or a 4 by 3 slide with a lot of text and so on, which seems like a wasted opportunity. So instead, what if you do something like this? Since it's a video board, it's not a projector, it's very bright, and you can engage with the slide, be part of the slide, and still make that connection with the audience. It just depends on your topic, but you design the slide with your presentation in mind that day, how you will interact with the slide moving around, not just sticking behind a lectern. So you could do something like this. And of course, you can bring in visual displays, quantitative displays such as this, and interact with it. And of course, you could always put the QR code up there, which is always good advice anyway for your last slide. So this might be extremely massive, but for most people, if they see something like this, they kind of freak out. I mean, what can I do with this? But it's also a great opportunity. So you can just kind of think about different ways you can make it more of a cinematic experience. Just depends on your topic, of course. So I'm spitballing here. I'm just putting some ideas together. Let's say, especially if it was anything to do with, astrophysics, science, space, whatever, you could obviously, that lends itself to being a very visual kind of experience. You definitely would not want to put a wall of text up there to talk about the universe or the cosmos or the planets. It just depends. Each case is different. This is something I took from NASA. But you could imagine, just as a way to kind of stimulate your creativity, imagine how you could use a really wide screen to create visuals where you could interact with them and make it a much more cinematic experience for the audience. You could do something like this. Let's say we're talking about the famous Earthrise. So let's say, here we are, July 16th, 1969, a photo that would change the world, and the familiar Earthrise. But you could do stuff like this. Let's say we have a scientist here or a science communicator who's talking about the Apollo 11 mission, and they want to interact with the image and bring it closer so the audience can see it better. For example, talking about the kind of boots and the tracks left behind, which are still there to this day. And then you could pull back out. So this is just using the morph tool in Keynote, or in PowerPoint, Magic Move in Keynote. And I'm using Keynote here. Okay, so let's look at a real world example. So a few years ago, I was in Paris giving a seminar. People came from all over Europe and even the United States for presentations and seminar. And in that audience was Dr. Enfeld. Andreas Einfeld is a medical doctor from Sweden who specializes in family medicine, especially having to deal with nutrition.
10 years later.
So today, Andreas, of course, is back in Sweden, and he launched a company called Hava. This is their website, which itself is really well designed and is very visual and is sort of Apple-ish in a way, and that the design of it really reflects the brand itself. Just some examples of that. But anyway, what I wanted to share with you and what I was so impressed with is this presentation that Hava did and Andreas did along with another medical doctor from Seattle on launching this product, which is an app for the smartphone to help people eat right, select the correct foods, and just monitor their health. So, but that's not what I'm interested in. What I'm interested in is how they designed the slides, how they chose the screen. So I talked with Andreas on Zoom after this.
So we went to 3 different places actually that all had these super wide screens. And then we picked this one which we felt was the best for us.
This is even more than cinematic. This is going back like
Yeah.
to the old movies from the 60s that were super wide. It's a really
Yeah,
cool.
exactly. I mean,
And
it
then
was a lot of pushback from inside the company, like people, should we take a cheaper place? What does it
mhm.
matter? But I think it does matter.
So the slides were designed with this great aspect ratio in mind, very wide, a beautiful resolution, as you can see. Now the room is darkened, which is still a really good idea to do, even though the screen is very bright. And I think it was Steve Martin in his biography that mentioned that, and at least in the case of comedy, of course, performing in a comedy club, if the lights are left on, it just kills the ambiance. But I think that's not true just for comedy, but for keynote addresses, conferences, often you don't have to make it dark like exactly like a nightclub, but you do want to dim the lights a little bit just to let people kind of relax. It's story time, right? I think we've evolved as humans just to equate a darkened room, like sitting around by the campfire and seeing these visuals and the presenter together is just, it's just a very cinematic experience. So I'm just very impressed with how they designed the slides. Very simple, lots of empty space, but they did a good job, I think, telling their story and giving evidence. I don't think the visuals distracted from the talk. I think, on the contrary, I think the visuals amplified. I mean, imagine just giving a speech about this product or going through a bunch of bulleted slides. It's even at 16 by 9 or 4 by 3, of course. So anyway, it was the content and it's the message that's important, but the visuals really, really did amplify this message, I think. And anyway, go check this out. So there's the link below. And I really do think they did a really good job with this. And I think it's a really good example of a cinematic presentation.